Hey, I'm Chris, and welcome to episode 11 of the Reunion Church podcast. This is Sunday Recaps, where we discuss a couple key points from the previous service for those that missed it, discussing how it may help you live out your faith. And this week, on this last Sunday here, we actually are wrapping up our series on an ordinary life. And one of the aspects that we talked about mainly was kind of learning culture. Right, Andrew, and kind of what that means, what that looks like in seeing how to learn culture and how we learn culture. Just before we get into the nitty gritty, Andrew, as far as your thoughts of last night, how do you think last night went overall? And just what were your general thoughts?
I thought it overall went pretty good. I mean, I don't think I've ever said that it went bad. So I think it's always been great.
I hope not.
Yeah. So yeah, it's been great. We've had a few people that we've recently kind of re-engaged with that have come out and stuff. So we've had some really good discussions that have picked up, and we got some new banners and flags, and seeing you and Joseph try to figure out how to put that together was great. So
yeah, really good.
Yeah. We had Coach David come out.
So that guy was cool. First time there. So there's so many people.
Yeah. So a good friend of mine, Mo, and his wife Deja and stuff were out, and I really like them. They have a lot of good things to kind of add and different perspectives to bring. If you guys have never heard Mo's testimony, it's pretty wild and all that stuff. We'll have to have him on the podcast sometime. Yeah. So he's a awesome guy. Him and his family. We've known each other and done ministry together for quite a few years and stuff. So yeah, it's been really cool. But yeah, it was really good. So
yeah, I thought it was really cool. Especially with Mo being there when we were talking about culture, because that's something that, with his testimony and his story, he brought a lot of insights that we kind of needed for our discussion, as far as like, what does it mean to learn culture? What does it mean to engage with culture and see culture in general? There's a lot of places to kind of start with that discussion, and even just talking about culture is such a vague idea for some people. Andrew, can you kind of talk about why you started with language and why that was a good jumping off point to learn about culture and understand it for our study?
Yeah. So, I mean, number one, language is one of the first things that we kind of learn on our basic culture of how we make sense of the noises that are coming out, what was positive, what's negative, when you think about like a baby and stuff, of, the certain type of noises that you start putting together, and how parents get excited around some of those words. And then you start saying certain words that you find are a negative impact. And so you start learning that, but it's all cultural based. Based on what's being reflected and the generation of that culture and stuff. So it was a really good spot for us to kind of just start. And plus, that's what we talked about last time, was culture, and was around language itself. And we have that other podcast. It would be posted by now, right?
Yeah, it'll be posted by this point. Yeah,
great. So we're filming this ahead of time, guys, in case you're confused what we're talking about. But yeah, so there's a podcast that we have around language and stuff that we talked and shared our thoughts and just biblical perspectives, and we talked about that. So
just a correction, the cursing and swearing episode will be a bonus episode after this one, just to correct. So anyway,
gotcha. Well, then they can keep on waiting. So
yes, they can wait.
Yeah, all 5 of our followers.
Yeah. And 6, Coach David.
Yeah.
So as far as like the language part kind of goes too, there's a lot of assumptions that kind of come with culture and language in general. And as we went through this study, you kind of walked us through a bunch of passages in Luke, John, Mark, all of the Gospels, of moments where Jesus was kind of calling out assumptions in culture that the disciples had specifically. What maybe share like one of those examples of what one of those assumptions may have been in those passages, and how Jesus kind of flipped it on its head and pointed out what this assumption does as far as a cultural context goes.
Yeah. So one of the I think there were two that we pointed out, from John chapter 9 and Luke chapter 18. There were two references where people had their perception on how people got saved and what a good person really was. And in that cultural time, if you were rich and wealthy, you had God's favor essentially on you. And so they viewed people who had wealth, who were wealthy, in that component of like, hey, you have God's favor and most likely you're going to heaven. And that's where some of the thoughts were there when they said, when Jesus is talking about like, through the eye of a needle, and the disciples are like, well, who the heck can be saved, right?
Yeah.
It's because in their perspective, they're like, these guys are supposed to have the favor of God on them. But that was the cultural expectation. It would be very similar to, what most people would think of like a good saint, or, Mother Teresa, and she may not get into heaven, and people are like, well, who could get saved, right? And that's essentially what it was saying. John chapter 9 is the other aspect of it, where Jesus was talking through and was talking about and saw the disabled person, someone who was limp and wasn't able to walk. And the disciples saw this and they were like, hey, who sinned? Who messed up? And they saw all those injuries as something as like, there was someone at fault here. Who was it? And that was a cultural thing. That's how they were taught to make sense of the world. If someone's hurt, if someone's injured, that's what they saw. Probably pretty similar to how a lot of us see homeless people. When we have them, we have a cultural precept of, they're addicts.
Right.
Oh, hey, there's a homeless person. They have really screwed up their life and there's something wrong with them.
They brought this on themselves. They earned it.
Yep. Yeah. They don't even try. Is kind of the cult. And like, so they're like, those are some of the cultural precepts that we have of things of like, hey, wow, like Mother Teresa was a really, really good person and donates all this money and did all these great things. If she can't get into heaven, who can?
Right.
And then on the other side of like, well, we look at homeless people and like, oh, well, they brought this on themselves. Like, they're addicts and, we live in America. It's one of the best places. How could they do this to themselves?
Right.
But it's a way that we don't take the time to actually know their story. We just automatically assume this is exactly what's wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's how we see people, and there is an immediate understanding on how we view the culture, how we make sense of the world. And so there were a ton of examples that we had in the scriptures of how the disciples fell into this quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what was interesting with our discussion too last night was not just that there's assumptions in how we see things in culture with how we speak and talk about other people and reference them, but in the way that Jesus drew attention to those assumptions. It was a very specific way of drawing attention to these assumptions. How did Jesus kind of draw attention to this in a way that was not judgmental, but more of like, do you notice what you're even saying sort of thing? Like there's kind of a tightrope that Jesus was kind of walking here between drawing attention to something that was, a judgmental assumption on the disciples' part, but at the same time, he was kind of pointing them to, like, for instance, the woman who washed Jesus' feet when he talked to Peter and said, do you see this woman before you? And if you look at the original language, the term woman in that context was the highest honorable mention of how to refer to a woman. It was the most honorable way of saying woman in that culture. So Jesus was not only saying, this woman, he was saying this revered, honorable woman, like how did Jesus kind of walk that tightrope between addressing something, but also correcting at the same point?
I mean, I think you pretty much kind of answered it, right? Is he just drew out the attention to it of like, you guys aren't really seeing the people. You're not really seeing, like what do you do with the woman there? What you're talking about? Like, do you see her? Do you see these people? Do you see this? Right. And I think we have to be patient with people too. When they're coming into these cultural contexts, we have to be patient with our grandparents. We have to be patient with our parents. And we have to be like, and other people will have to be patient with us as we're trying to learn these things. Because we've all made sense of the world one way or another, and most likely it's probably been wrong. because we haven't viewed it through the lens of Jesus. We haven't viewed it through the kingdom lens. And so Jesus was always pointing those things out and just, using different words, different things that would be like, well, wait a second, that doesn't quite make sense to how we've always done things or how we've always looked at things, right? And so he'd take basic cultural artifacts and challenge them a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And as we were kind of discussing that too last night, we kind of elaborated like, this is it's easy to point at somebody in the Bible of like, look how, terrible they were. The disciples had all these assumptions and Jesus was always calling them out. But then the discussion became a lot more personal where we moved on to, well, who were key people who kind of influence the way you speak, the way you approach life, the way you talk about other people, like the assumptions that we're kind of raised with in general. How does that even affect us as far as like mentors, parents, teachers, like how much of an effect do they have in the assumptions that we have and how we talk about people and things?
I mean, they're the ones that mentored us and have taught us how to make sense of the world. An abusive parent could teach them something entirely wrong of like, hey, this is a positive word, when the rest of the culture is like, no, that's a very negative word itself, right? Because they're the first ones to actually kind of teach them something. And so you're looking for that positive reinforcement coming from those things. The same thing goes for a lot of our mentors. A lot of the people that have always taught us or uplifted us into certain things, the way that we kind of see and make sense of the world. So parents, the way your dad has always treated your mom will make an impact, because even though they never sat you down and said, this is how you treat women, that's how it makes sense. The way that your mom might react to a situation around men, how she views men, maybe she's always scared of them, will teach something. There's those, all these different movements that people are trying to do of like trying to avoid toxic masculinity, and then they'll actually go to the other extreme and they're actually teaching them something instead, by reinforcing such a different mindset of creating fear in them of like, no, you can't do this. And that's teaching them something else of like, something's different here. Something's wrong in the way that this is making sense of the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're teaching them those components as parents. There's the teachers that we highly respect in our schools, who had an impact on us. There's pastors that have mentored us, youth pastors. My testimony was from my youth pastor who had a huge impact in my life. And, he was a very dominant type of personality. And I saw the way that he led his family. And that was a cultural way of seeing things, in the way that, hey, I like need to lead. And this is the way that I need to be leading itself. But it didn't teach me how to listen. It didn't teach me how to listen to my children or how to listen to my wife, right? And so there are all these different things that we can kind of learn from people, from our friends, people that we highly respect, in our friendships as well, that will be teaching us something on how to make sense, again, of the world itself, on how they deal with race, how they deal with the opposite sex, how they deal with their own identity and their own sex as a man or a woman, how they deal with authority, what their view of authority is, how they deal with sickness, how they deal with tragedy. The way you see your mentors kind of deal with tragedy itself will teach you something in that. How they deal with hypocrites. There's a lot of people who don't have any patience for Christians and for hypocrite Christians. And that's something that was modeled to them. They saw pastors, they saw their mentors being very angry towards people like this, instead of being very patient and loving and working towards them.
Mm-hmm. And I know you're kind of touching on, pros and cons of things that we've seen in other people that we look up to, and then we mimic it in the way we communicate, the way we treat people. But what's sort of before we move on to the roles of men and women specifically, because that was part of our discussion, how do we filter what someone's taught to us and know if it's a good assumption to have about something or a bad assumption? Like, where do we draw that distinction? Because it can be really hard to even identify an assumption in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, it's the Sunday school answer of Jesus, it has to be drawn through that filter
Yeah.
And so Jesus is in the business of unlearning a lot of these things for us. You don't have to be ashamed of your culture. You don't have to be ashamed. Like, you have to contextualize it, but you also have to realize that you could be reading the Bible through that lens as well. And that's how you justify, like, no, this is the right way. We saw that a ton during the 2020 freaking elections,
Yeah.
where people were filtering the Bible through their political eyes. And like, to me, that is absolutely disgusting. It's very hard for us to get past that, but we sit there and we will filter it through and just, say that, Jesus would have been a Republican, or Jesus would have been a Democrat, or all these things. It's like, man, like, no, you have to filter that through the lens of the kingdom of God, and really kind of look through those, because not all those things are biblical. Not all these stances are the right way that Jesus would have responded in them. And so you have to really kind of evaluate, like, okay, is this really something that Jesus has actually taught me, and has led me through this? Or is this something that I'm allowing to look through a cultural Western lens? For all of us that are listening today, it would be through a Western lens.
Yeah.
Is that how, when you're reading the Bible, a very simple thing, and this is something that we go through, of like, what would it have meant to the reader back in that day? That reader would not have been a Westerner. That reader would have been Middle Eastern man, several thousand years ago, without any type of technology. So what would that passage have meant to that person? And you have to untrain, okay, this is what they would have been going through. This is what they would have been thinking through. And that's how you can start. That's the best place to start, is to start reading your Bible and looking at it through that lens, right? And then just allowing, what is Jesus trying to teach you on some of these things, to make sense of, like, okay, is this really a biblical value, or is this something that was taught to me through someone else?
Yeah, absolutely. And then actually what you just said reminded me of the sermon that I watched yesterday of Perry Mason. He's a pastor of Epiphany Fellowship, and he was talking about deconstructing and unlearning things, and what good deconstruction kind of looks like. And just to move on quickly, what Perry said was, what God leaves to mystery, Satan has an answer to, right? So as far as that deconstruction part, or unlearning something, if there's an answer to it, probably because God gave an answer. A lot of the parables have answers that we're not aware of, because we don't know the original meaning, and we have to unlearn the way we read it and look at the way it's meant to be read. Whereas there's a lot of things that are left mysterious that God leaves up, because we're not meant to know it. We're not meant to know when he comes back. We're not meant to know certain things. And Satan always has an answer for it, because he's always trying to deceive us. So kind of moving on though, Andrew, as far as specifically unlearning patterns, unlearning the way we communicate, as far as men and women go, how do we understand that part? Because today there's a lot of confusion as far as what is a man, what is a woman, and people have a lot of strong opinions. They have a lot of strong takes on this in particular. How do we kind of handle the discussion last night as far as what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman? Like, what are some things we have to unlearn in that process?
Yeah, so we talked a lot, and we kind of opened up with, like, what were some of the things that of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. And I think most of us are pretty familiar of some of the normal responses we'd probably get around that, of, oh, hey, like, a man needs to be the provider. A man needs to be the one that is strong. The man needs to be the one that is leading. But then we also have to, okay, what did we see that actually be? What did it look like to not see a man? And when you think about that, you see, like, the cowering aspect, men who cower, men who won't take a stand necessarily. And so there's that drastic fear that a lot of men will have, of, like, the cowering component. And then there's also the component of the hulkish component, where you're walking on eggshells. You're scared of the crazy eyes. They lose their temper at spilt milk, and things like that. So there's a lot of those things of like, we're very much afraid of losing our identity as men if we're not very loud, very strong, and there's this, well, do we shrink? And that's what a lot of men think when they're talking about trying to get rid of toxic masculinity, or are we buying into it with the hulkish mindset? And so what is the middle ground? What does that even look like? What was Jesus? Because you'll hear people, well, Jesus chased people out with whips and things. And then you've got other aspects of that he was, you have the picture of Jesus holding a little sheep and stuff,
Right.
So what was Jesus? What do we actually
Yeah.
see? So there's this definition of like, well, are we fighting? Are we cowering? Are we shrinking? What is a man? And then for women, it's the same thing where, we see women more so, even more of a redefinitioning happening in the culture. But women were to, be submissive and take care of the house, to be good cooks, to clean, that they were to be supportive. And that was the older mindset of what a lot of people had. An ideal woman is an Enneagram 2, on
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
And
men could be every other number, but women are only 2s.
Yeah. Women, like the ideal woman is an Enneagram 2. And it's like, well, no, like that's not really what the case is. But that was kind of like that hulkish mindset of men. Those were both coming out of like the Victoria era, where you have these men who, very hulkish, very disconnected, wouldn't connect with people. You wouldn't share your feelings, anything like that. And then you've got the women who, stay at home and, are good with the family. They don't try to go out of their way to be loud or lead or anything like that. They can lead their family and that's about it. But we see this big shift now happening where women are having more power to be much louder, to be the leaders, and men, honestly kind of shrinking and being okay with that. And, so what does that look like? Where is that? We have the cancel culture aspect now, and, women fighting everything against a man for man spreading, or, all these different components. And then men just letting it happen, or going to the again, whatever you guys are hearing the news, everyone knows what essentially we're kind of seeing. You can kind of fill in the blank. And so what we have to do is, again, what do we see in the scriptures? What do we see in Jesus, how he kind of, takes care of those definitions? And so for men, when you're trying to define a man, you look at what the scriptures clearly say. And most of our definitions usually involve trophies or family. So we're trying to earn trophies, either money or our success in a career or success in, a sport, a hobby, something like that. We're trying to earn trophies.
We're always chasing something.
Yeah, we're always chasing something like that, or trying to earn the respect of a family name, and trying to earn the respect of our dads, whatever it might be. And so we're so afraid of losing any of that. And so there's this false measurement idea. And so we're always measuring ourselves, whether that's with your job and your success and where you're at and comparing yourself to someone else, or whether it's with your position or wealth or your church size, or you're always measuring something.
Boys are always measuring something. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Your shoe size and all those other things that we've talked about. So, and it's the same thing to God, whether you're measuring your church size, or measuring how successful your ministry is, or measuring how good you are at your job, or how much money you have, or your dong size. Like that is all the same thing, God, of like, hey, knock it off. Like no one cares, and you shouldn't care. That isn't going to give you the definition of a man in anyone's eyes itself. And so there's these false measurements, and we see that happening actually through the life of Matthew, where you can see Matthew and how people tried to measure him up at the beginning of like by his job, by his family, but Jesus just flat out calls him a man, that he was a man. And that's why Matthew was confident in listing himself with a disdain job where people didn't enjoy that. For women, we see, you mentioned about Jesus looking specifically at this woman that the rest of the world would have shamed. But Jesus didn't shame her. Jesus didn't shame people at all. When they came to him and they gave his and they gave their trust to him, and they shared, and Jesus, exposed the hard truths in their life, there was no shame. And so for women, they should not be trying to cover up any of their shame. They shouldn't be trying to cover up some of these things. They already are beautiful. They were made to be cherished. They are important. They are those equals in a different light. They're not made for again, a type of trophy or news, which Zach Swain kind of talks about. That's why there might be this tendency for the gossip aspect of it, because we're always just trying to get in the news, and women have that tendency that they think that's what they want, but that adds them as a trophy. And that's not what your intended purpose was. Your intended purpose is that you are seen, you are important, and you are valued, and you have a lot to add, to everything in leading with this. So there's this beauty that should frighten a man, essentially, to not even remotely harm or, try to abuse in any way itself.
Yeah. From that, when we think about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and how really the key indicator for Jesus himself was that just the fact that you were created by him was enough worth, was enough purpose and meaning to your life. You didn't need to be identified by all these other things. We kind of ended with how others see us and how we can't really live up to what others see in us and the expectations that they set. Kind of just to wrap up, Andrew, what should be our response to how other people see us? And then how should we respond ourselves when we are not what we think we're supposed to be?
Yeah. So there's a difficulty that every one of us has, probably 70 different titles, if you listed them out. So, Chris, you're a son, you are a nephew, you're an uncle, and you're an uncle several different times. You're a brother, you're a grandson, you are an employee, you are a leader, you are a pastor, you are, all these different titles that you could list out. And that adds a lot of pressure, as like people start looking at this and look at you on how they see you based on that lens of, okay, this is what, a father should be. This is what a son should be. This is what a grandson should be. This is what, and then when you add the other components, a grandson that is a pastor, a grandson or a, employee that is a pastor, that can change how people will perceive you and their expectation. And you have to be okay that that's just not going to be realistic. You're not going to be able to live up to all those different expectations. And you have to be okay with letting that go. Just as you will get the expectations wrong and how you view people, other people are going to do the same thing for you. So you must be patient and be willing to be wronged. Like, you will be wronged by people, but don't go around trying to please everyone, especially extended family will be the hardest ones. Because a lot of us will have a desire to please them. A lot of us will have that desire, to go out of our way and take care of those components. But when it comes to your calling and what God has specifically called us to do, you can't allow that to hold you back. You can't allow the expectation of what others are trying to place on you and their definitions of what that should look like. You have to move on from those things. And what we talked about is that if you do, that'll burn you out. It'll burn you out. It'll make you go crazy, and you'll end up giving up on your calling. And that's not what God wants you to do at all. And you have to realize that everyone is in this process of 1 Corinthians 13:12, that everyone is in this muggy, foggy mirror that they're trying to view things. And even if they're Christians, they're not going to get it perfect. You are not going to get it perfect.
Right.
God is in the business of unblinding us, of helping us to unsee things and see things clearly through his eyes. That's what he did with the disciples, and was continuously helping them see, hey, you guys have this one expectation of what the Messiah is, what everyone else is. We're going to unfilter and undo this a little bit here so you can see clearly. Are we ever going to see clearly on this side of heaven? No. But we will be able to see more clearly as it goes on. So.
Right. And let's pause for a minute.
That's just Lillian. It's fine.
Okay.
It's just my daughter.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, in general, I thought this was one of our better discussions we had during this entire series. I think, the conversations that were had, the um, just discussions that were brought up, and the questions actually were a lot different because, again, we had some more new people that showed up. So as the church is growing, we're getting more diversity in thought and people, and really appreciating the insights that we're getting from all age groups and all cultures that are showing up. But any final thoughts before we go to our announcements and tie this up?
No, go to the freaking announcement that's coming up.
Okay, fine. So September 19th, we have our Grace Talk series coming up. This is going to be a 12-week continuous conversation on what grace is, what grace looks like, and it's going to be very different than what most churches say when they talk about grace. We're going to take a really in-depth look in what the Bible says, what God really means when he talks about grace. And I think it's going to really open you up to what grace means in your life and how to apply it and how to live a grace-filled life. So we want to invite you 5:30 to 7 every Sunday. We're going to start that series again on September 19th. And with that, anything else, Andrew, happening that I'm missing? I think that is
the one. That is the one right there. Lillian's very curious about this podcast.
I was working so hard to remember the date, so I'm very proud of myself.
You did great about that. You remember the
Thank
date.
you.
Yeah. You almost had your opening line perfect. Hopefully, maybe one of these days you'll actually have the reunion podcast logo that Bethany spent so much time putting together up.
Right.
And you'll have it pre-recorded so you don't have to do that every time.
I know. Yeah. But one day I will remember to do.
Jesus is working in you. It's fine.
So. He's doing so much work.
Yeah.
It's like a Colorado construction site. It will never be done. All right. Well, we'll talk to you guys later, and we'll see you Sunday.